Hi, Melina. Hi, everyone. Thanks for sending these questions about Sensorimotor Life. They're very interesting questions. I will try to give you a first draft of some answers, and I'm sure there will be probably more questions following these answers, but I will try to maybe see if I can address the main worries that you have. And I apologize for speaking in English. Most of the technical vocabulary here is in English, so rather than speaking in Spanish and translate halfway all the time, I just give you the answers in English. So let's see. First question concerns cellular automata and whether they're a good experiential base for an activism. This is a good question, and in order to answer this question, we need to keep in mind the role of models in science and in philosophy. And then the question is not so much whether these examples of cellular automata, such as Vittorio, has been used, since the 80s or something, and or the Game of Life, etc. Whether these examples are good instantiations of the phenomena that we're trying to understand, or whether they are good models. Because being a good model does not imply being to replicating the system that we're interested in very, very faithfully. In fact, if we did that, we wouldn't gain anything from having a model. A model in this case in particular is aimed at providing us an easier way to understand the relations between different concepts and different ideas. So there is no problem in principle for models to be abstract, provided we understand that what we're doing there is using the models to help us see how the ideas relate to each other, such as whether the idea of autonomy would have a good instantiation in a world of cellular automata where the laws of physics are not quite like the laws of physics we have now. I should mention that it's also sometimes difficult to know how far can these models go. Sometimes, even if we don't have the realistic physics of the real world in these models, the models can be quite complex, as shown very recently by the work of Randall Beer, who have been exploring the Game of Life, another cellular automaton, and discovering all sorts of complexities and all kind of analogs to enactive ideas, provided that we understand it as instantiated, maybe partially, in that world, the world of the cellular automaton. So models are useful when we're dealing with complex systems, and that we're not to be thought as the other meaning of models, which is models that we follow, like we follow a leader, we follow an idea, we follow a model. It's more like the model is a helpful tool. So are these entities capable of sense making or things like that? Well, no, not for real, of course. There are other conditions that must be met for agency and sense making in the real world. What we have is perhaps a good model, a good analogy of the concept of sense making, or at least some elements of such a concept, when we see, for instance, an entity in such models preserving itself like a glider in the Game of Life, and interacting, defining its domain of interactions, and so on. And that's helpful, that's all. We shouldn't look at it as instantiations of these ideas. This relates a little bit with the next question, which is about precariousness. How do you define precariousness? Is it to do with timescales and so on? Well, precariousness is very clearly defined in the enactive literature. It is I don't know if I recall the exact definition, but it is the tendency that all material systems have to disaggregate or overflow or simply change any positive property that you might identify as useful. So that means the following. If you're building a system that you want certain parts to fulfill certain functions or to play a certain role, And you rely on those properties, say the solidity of a mechanical part, in a robot, for instance, or the pliability of something that must move and be, able to bend to pressure. Those properties, the properties that you're interested in, have a timestamp. They are not going to be like that forever. Precariousness tries to capture that lack of continuity. Well, no, lack of guarantee of a property of any mechanical system or any material system. So by that, why is that even interesting? Well, of course, it relates to the question of timescales, because, of course, when we talk about precarious systems and precariousness being an essential idea that goes behind the idea of autonomy and the inactive conception of life, we're talking about, of course, this lack of guarantee that the properties will stay the same, this instability or metastability, is occurring at the timescale of the processes of life. We're not talking here about the precariousness of geological systems, which are precarious too. But we're talking about the chemical systems, the chemical reactions, the concentrations that make up the metabolism are not themselves externally sustained or have properties that we can use to consider them as almost stable throughout the lifetime of that living system. On the contrary, they are unstable, and often what happens is that we need the organization of life, we need autonomy in order to stabilize these properties. So here the idea of precariousness relates to the previous question, because in a way, through it, we can start making a distinction between models and instantiations that is more clear. We might have been confused if we didn't have the idea of precariousness and thought, well, provided that there is some circularity and the autonomy of the organization, it doesn't matter if it is a chemical system or a cellular automaton or other systems, or even an abstract system, like, in mathematics you have group theory and you have all kinds of closures through different kinds of operations or certain sets that define groups. Why is that not a case of autonomy? Well, what we want to say is that the autonomy that characterizes life and mine is an autonomy that is always realized in precarious conditions. And this will be important because it will connect to other questions that come up, because the idea of sense making is already embedded in this internal tension of life, which is there is no guarantee that you can continue to live every time you're enacting in order to continue to remain viable. If you didn't, we would be like a very inert system that perseveres over time, as opposed to a system that is continuously individuating. And that's the difference we want to capture. And the idea of precariousness is what helps us do that. Interestingly, precariousness also separates the inactive perspective from traditional functionalism. I might even say even modern functionalism. Because, why is that? Well, because any function that you can describe in your system such that will make up the architecture of sense-making or cognition requires you to rely on positive properties, such as, for instance, being able to act as a filter for information, being able to transport, communicate this bit to that bit. Everything must function. In that sense, any functional architecture that explains cognition will always be too stable. It will be lacking the constant risk that is given by the fact that every single element, every single part in our bodies is precarious, so that they're being sustained by the overall activity as well as contributing to it. So you see, there's a difference in the idea of what it constitutes a living body or a cognitive system, and it cannot just be a set of boxes and functions. It must be also relations that stabilize, regenerate the material conditions for that system to continue to exist. So let's see. The next question is maybe connected, is the difference between enaction and embodiment. Well, as labels, we talk about embodiment in a more general sense when we talk about embodied cognitive science. Enactive cognitive science would be part of it, but there are other approaches to embodiments that are not necessarily like enactive. They may share some parts, some ideas with enaction, and maybe some differences too. You have ecological psychology, you've got extended functionalism, and so on. But that may not be the question you're asking. I'm not so sure. If you ask questions within an active cognition paradigm, and you say, when you use the word enaction, what do you refer to within this paradigm? And when you use the word embodiment, what do you refer to? Well, yeah, embodiment is essentially being able to be a body, constituting yourself as a body of many kinds. There's not just the one kind of body. You've got biological, organizational autonomy, you've got sensorimotor autonomy, you've got social life, linguistic bodies, and so on. Enaction describes the actual engagement of this body in the world, what it does in order to change the world and change itself. That would be the two differences. The difference at the label level, and the difference at the conceptual level within enaction itself. Now, how does that relate to other things? Well, it relates to the next question about norms and mechanisms. Is there a distinction between them? Yeah, sure there is. We're talking about different things when we're talking about norms and mechanisms. The question is oriented towards the idea of sense making, and asks whether a system that is a sense maker has to be aware of the norms that it is following. Yes, okay, first let me clarify one thing. Norms and mechanisms, there are different ideas, and they're not incompatible ideas, in case you suspected that when you have mechanisms there are no norms involved. You just have to look at any mechanical system and technological system. A car is a mechanism, you could say. It's an technical object, and of course it follows norms. It has to run, it has to be safe, it has to be efficient, all kinds of norms. So there's no incompatibility with the idea that mechanisms are part of systems for which norms are relevant. That is not a problem. But I guess the problem is whether you think, or one entails that when you got a living system, and perhaps a minimal living system like bacteria, and they're acting according to norms, whether they are aware of this acting according to norms. No, they don't have to, of course. Being aware that we are acting according to norms is something quite sophisticated. It's something that perhaps linguistic beings can do only, because we can reflect. We have reflective consciousness, and we can reflect about why we do what we do, and that's why we become aware of the normativity. But the normativity is not an epistemological concept. The idea of an action is that norms are real, the things that happen in the world. And they are instantiated whenever there is a precarious form of autonomous life, autonomous sense-making, that is struggling to survive and remain viable. Norms are what describe of all, the valence of all the possibilities that could happen, all the things that could happen to that system, with respect to the viability of that system, not with respect to my opinion as an external observer. So an agent will and can follow norms without being aware that it is following norms. But there's something I have to say, because in the question they say, it operates blindly, therefore? Is it like, can it follow the norms operating blindly? And you might think that what I just said is yes, they can. Well, wait a minute. Being aware that you follow a norm is one thing. Being blind is another thing. Blind metaphorically, being totally indifferent. That's not what we're saying. You might be following norms and you're not aware of them as norms, but we're postulating in this idea of continuity between life and mind, we're postulating that all life has mental life and has interiority and has affectivity. So it is not blind. It is, it has, that life has a stake in the outcomes of the situation, whether you will find the shelter or the food or the warmth that you need. And if it doesn't, it is a felt difference for them. For that, life is essentially being invested existentially and experientially as well. So there is no blindness, even though there may not be any awareness of a higher kind of awareness of what it is, what kinds of norms you're following. So does that relate to the next question, which is a typical one? If you're a cognitive ancient and you're concerned with sustaining your form of life, how is it possible that suicide exists? How is it? Well, yeah, that's a very common question. Well, we have to be careful here. What we have to distinguish, as I already mentioned briefly, is that there are different forms of autonomy and identity involved in living systems, and especially in complex living systems. We individuate ourselves as this biological body itself, because of being complex and multicellular and involving all kinds of microorganisms and different species in some sort of ecology. It's already a complex system with many levels of autonomy. You got the autonomy of metabolism, but you got the autonomy of the nervous system and the autonomy of the immune system. You got the autonomy of the relations between the extracellular matrix and the activity of the cells. You got even the biomechanical autonomy of the musculoskeletal system and the tensegrity organization of tensions and extensions and so on, and support between bones, tendons, muscles. All kinds of autonomy already at the physiological, biological level. Not to mention then that, as we say in the Sensorimotor Life book, that we have also a sensorimotor autonomy, that couples our connections with the world, with our interactions, into networks or repertoires of possibilities for actions and activities that themselves can become self-sustaining. And the typical case here would be a case of a habit. Okay? So the question of suicide could also be the question of, why do people engage in dangerous or harmful habits? Why do they smoke if it is bad for their health? It's a similar question. And you can already see that if you understand the answer in one case, you will understand the answer in the other too. Simply because all these identities, which are not separated, but they're not identical either, they overlap. All these identities can and do enter into ongoing conflicts. So the case of suicide is difficult to analyze in detail, but our first rule, the first approximately, sufficient explanation is that we are here concerned with a conflict of identities. One that would be a social, linguistical, historical, personal identity of a person who has accumulated a series of experiences for whom that life has lost meaning, or the circumstances have pushed them to a boundary. The suffering that they go through at these social, cultural, sensorimotor levels spreads throughout the whole body in a way that it cannot be disentangled. And a decision comes along, a decision to terminate life. And it is that decision that is a decision that comes out of this unresolvable conflict of identities. I'm saying it this a bit too quickly. I'm not sure it covers every single case, but I think all the answers in each particular case will probably be a version of this idea of conflicts of identities. You have to be also aware that if you take if you overdose on sleeping pills in order to kill yourself, your immune system will still try to fight to survive. So you can see the body is still trying to live at that physiological level. So it's a complex issue, but I don't see it as entirely problematic. It deserves more investigation, same as the issue of conflicts between habits and between different dimensions of embodiment. But I don't see that this is going to be a make or break question for the enactive approach. Let's see, because the next question relates a bit to this, and if you like putting it going in the opposite direction, what about play? Play does not seem to give us any biological advantages or advantages to our way of life, although many people actually say that it does. But perhaps they do say that it does because they want to explain play as part of something making evolutionary sense. And there are all kinds of things like, the youngsters of different predator species play with semi-dead prey in order to train themselves, in order to be better hunters and things like that. There's a vast literature on play that tries to reduce play to a functionalist, evolutionary explanation. And there is obviously lots of evidence that there is some connection, obviously, between being able to exercise certain capacities in a safe situation, a situation of play, and getting some training out of it. But that's not what we think play is about. Play is precisely an exploration in novel forms of sense-making. A certain felt pleasure, a sort of felt fun, usually socially enacted with others, is felt while we explore, undermine, and create new norms and new possibilities with our actions. So here play becomes actually an activity that demonstrates the enactive approach at play. It demonstrates it by, if you study what play is about, you're acting and you're enacting new possibilities, and these possibilities become sedimented. Maybe the social play situation or the pretend play situation sediments a certain on-the-fly norm, like let's pretend that we are playing this game, or let's pretend that we are in this situation, and then we just follow it. That norm wasn't there before we started playing. I'm not talking about games. That's a sedimented version of what I'm saying. But it could be like a playful conversation, or a dancing conversation, or a game with some objects we just found, and we try to play with them. So that sediments the norms of sense making by acting itself. So this is something important here, is that the norms that emerge from the conservation of an identity are not forever fixed, and the system that is able to act with respect to norms will also be able to create new norms sometimes, according to circumstances and possibilities, of course. So that means that by creating new norms, you're transforming yourself, because there's this inherent connection between norms and viability of a system and constitution of a system. So you play, you stretch your norms, you create a game, and you do it with others, and then your own identity is being pulled into something new. You become a player of games. So that's quite interesting too, and of course not the last word on it. This is a very open and interesting topic. Let's see. Final couple of questions. How do you put micro-identities into a hierarchy or something like this? Can one be present? Micro-identities, we have to understand here, in the sensorimotor case, the constitution of clusters of activities, of habits, mutually enabling sensorimotor schemes, can constitute what we call micro-identities. At the same time, enacting them constitutes micro-worlds. The world I'm enacting when I go and prepare a meal in the kitchen, or when I'm commuting to work or whatever, are micro-worlds. They're different. They're not to be thought of as independent from each other. They're not to be thought as totally separate, because after all, they all are enacted through a same sensorimotor body. But it is true that they may, each of them, have their own normativity, their own autonomy to some extent. There is no hierarchy that we have to think of in this case. We can sometimes, for convenience, decide that there must be perhaps a cluster of clusters of activity, like all different ways in which we can prepare a meal, all the different commuting situations, taking the train, taking the bus, taking the airplane, and so on. That might be part of a general cluster of activity, let's call it. But at that level, I wouldn't call it micro-identity anymore. I would call it a cluster of similar activities. Genres, like a genre of speaking. It could be a genre of participating or living, which is a topic that we discuss in the Linguistic Bodies book. More to be said about this, but essentially don't think that these identities are floating independently of each other. At the same time, don't think that they're organized in a hierarchy either. It may or may not. It will depend on the sensorimotor life of each particular agent. Okay, how can enactivism understand imagination and dreams? Well, that's a big question, and I'm not going to be able to answer it really in detail here. But let me put it differently. Why wouldn't it? Why do you think it's difficult to understand imagination or dreams from an enactive perspective, or more difficult to do it this way than to do it from a functionalist perspective? I don't think it is. I don't think there is an inherent difficulty here. For understanding imagination, we still have to understand we have to take a series of steps from sensorimotor life to linguistic bodies. Because in this series of steps, ideas such as creating images have their place. They appear through this progression. They appear in a linguistic social context first. But everything that appears in the social context becomes also part of your possibilities as a linguistic body when you are on your own. So you can evoke images or ideas together by constructing a dialogue with others, and that power can also be turned towards yourself and be able to evoke possibilities and virtual actions and virtual images on your own. And that could be easily the beginnings of a theory of imagination from an enactive perspective. There's nothing mysterious about it. What happens during dreams? Yeah, okay. I just don't know. I think there's a lot to be said there, but I think, again, I don't have any inkling that this is a difficult question, or a particularly difficult question for an action as it is for any other approach. Something happens. I was just saying, what happens in dreams is not totally disconnected with what happens in our mental life when we're not overtly active, as in the case of paralysis and locked-in syndrome, which is something that we discuss in a piece of work with Miriam Kisello. You don't never cease to be active as a body, especially as a social body. And your linguistic engagements with yourself continue to exist. In the Linguistic Bodies book, we talk a little bit about narrativity and the experience of reading, which is another case that seems a bit easier to explain, but essentially we're talking about a similar thing. How is it that you get into a novel or into a story that you're reading, and what kind of if you like, engagement with the voice of the author that is represented in a text are you enacting, such that it takes you to a story that you can relate to and you can visualize and so on. I think there's more to be said, like with all of these questions, but I think, again, we're not talking about any problematic issue. We're talking about work to be done. And I think there's more chances that we can really explain imagination or imagery and dreams in this way than assuming them to be some kind of projected image inside our heads. However you want to qualify that, it is essentially you're not going to be able to really explain things with following this strategy of explaining like with like. You know, if I want to explain imagination, it must be some image, some little film going on inside me in order to that I'm viewing. That's not what we're doing. So again, like in all these other things, more to be said, but I think I probably covered all these questions. Once again, thank you for these thoughtful questions, and I hope this video helps. All right.